I watched my mother's car disappear around the corner, taillights blinking once, mockingly, I thought, before vanishing completely. 9 years old, standing under a broken street lamp in Morrison Park as darkness swallowed the playground whole. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since afternoon, and I wore only the thin cotton dress she'd insisted matched my sister's for the family photo we never actually took. That was the fifth time they'd forgotten me. Or so I'd believed in my first life before the semi-truck ran the red light on my 28th birthday and sent me careening back through time to wake up as my 6-year-old self, gasping in my childhood bedroom with 2 decades of memories that shouldn't exist yet. Before I knew the truth, they never forgot. They just didn't care. The memories of my previous life had crashed over me like a tsunami that morning 3 years ago. I'd woken up small, my hands pudgy and unmarked by the years of work that had calloused them, my body free of the chronic pain that had plagued my adult years. For one glorious moment, I'd thought it was a gift, a chance to do everything right, to make my family love me, to become the daughter they wanted. Then I'd walked downstairs and seen my mother's face as she looked at me, that familiar expression of faint distaste, and I'd understood with devastating clarity, it had never been my fault. In my first life, I'd spent 28 years trying to earn love from people constitutionally incapable of giving it to me. I'd excused every cruelty, internalized every criticism, believed every lie. When they forgot me at the park, the mall, the school, a friend's house, 15 documented times before I turned 18, I'd told myself they were busy, stressed, that I should have reminded them. When my mother spent thousands on my sister Melissa's figure skating lessons, cheer camp, and pageant dresses while I wore thrift store clothes with holes in the seams, I'd believed I simply wasn't worth investing in. When my father looked through me at the dinner table as if I were a ghost, I'd worked harder to be visible, never understanding that he saw me perfectly well. He just didn't like what he saw. The why of it I'd learned too late in my first life was breathtakingly simple. I wasn't his biological daughter. My mother's affair had produced me, and while she'd confessed before I was born, my father, Richard Chen, respected surgeon and pillar of the community, had agreed to raise me as his own for appearance's sake. His reputation mattered more than divorce, but his resentment had poisoned everything, turned my mother bitter and defensive, made Melissa, his precious real daughter, into a spoiled monster who'd learned she could torture me without consequence. I discovered this truth at 26, finding the paternity test results while cleaning out the attic. By then, I'd already been estranged from them for years, scraping by on retail, wages, and community college dreams deferred. The confirmation had almost been a relief. At least I'd finally understood. But understanding didn't erase the damage. I'd died alone, working a double shift at a diner, too poor to afford the surgery that might have caught the brain aneurysm before it killed me. No one came to my funeral, I knew, because I'd haunted the cemetery in those strange moments between death and rebirth, watching the city-funded burial of an unclaimed body. Then I'd woken up at 6 years old, and I'd made a decision that would define this second life. I would not spend one more second begging for their love. I would take everything they'd denied me, and I would make them watch. The park incident was my line in the sand. I'd known it was coming. In my first life, this had been the worst of their forgetting episodes. The one that landed me in the hospital with hypothermia and pneumonia, the one that triggered a CPS investigation that my father's lawyer friends had smoothly buried. This time, I'd prepared. 3 years of careful planning had led to this moment. 3 years of being the perfect, invisible daughter while I quietly laid my traps. I'd become a ghost in my own family, slipping through their lives unnoticed while I built my escape route, piece by careful piece. The first piece, my real father. In my previous life, I'd never known his name. But I had my mother's old journals, carelessly stored in the garage, and I had adult knowledge of how to decode her cryptic entries. Marcus Liu, violinist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, a brief affair during a summer music festival. She'd described him as passionate, kind, everything Richard wasn't. A simple internet search, hilariously easy once I'd convinced a teacher I needed computer access for a school project, revealed that Marcus had become even more successful than I'd imagined. He'd left the orchestra to found his own music education nonprofit, married a woman named Jennifer, had 2 sons. His foundation's website listed his email address, and I'd spent weeks crafting the perfect letter. DNA doesn't lie. I'd written in careful adult handwriting I'd had to relearn in this small body. And neither do birth certificates with correction fluid on them. I know what you did, and I know who I am. I don't want to ruin your life. I just want to know mine. I'd been terrified he'd ignore it, deny it, or worse, be exactly like Richard. But Marcus Liu was, it turned out, a genuinely good man who'd never known I existed. My mother had told him she'd gotten an abortion. The first phone call, made from a library payphone with quarters I'd saved from months of searching parking lots, had left him in tears. "I have a daughter," he'd whispered. "I have another daughter." We'd been careful. Secret phone calls, coded letters sent to my friend Sarah's house, plans laid for a future confrontation. Marcus wanted to fight for custody, but I'd convinced him to wait. "I need to let them destroy themselves first," I'd said with 8-year-old lips and 28 years of hard-earned wisdom. "If we move too soon, they'll play victim. We need to wait until the world can see what they really are." He'd hated it, but he'd agreed. And he'd sent money, cash, hidden in birthday cards mailed to Sarah's address, innocuous amounts that wouldn't trigger suspicion. $5,000 over 3 years, a fortune to a child, carefully hidden in a lockbox I'd buried in Sarah's backyard. The second piece, documentation. I'd become obsessive about it. Every forgotten pickup, recorded with timestamps in a diary I kept at school. Photos of the bruises from when Melissa accidentally pushed me down the stairs, taken with the school nurse's camera during a routine checkup. Copies made and hidden. Recordings of my mother's vitriol captured on a voice-activated tape recorder I'd bought at a yard sale for $2 and hidden in my bedroom vent. "Why do I even keep you around?" I had her saying crystal clear from a fight when I was 7. "You've been nothing but a burden since the day you were born. If I'd known what having you would cost me, I'd have gotten rid of you when I had the chance." Melissa's voice, shrill and cruel. "Dad wishes you'd never been born. He told me. He said you ruined everything, and he can't even look at you without wanting to puke." Richard's cold dismissal. "She's not my problem. Ask her real father to pay for it." When my mother complained about my needing new shoes. 3 years of evidence meticulously gathered, safely stored in triplicate. One set with Sarah's family, one in a safety deposit box Marcus had opened in my name, one with a lawyer Marcus had retained, just waiting for the right moment. The third piece? Witnesses. I'd been so isolated in my first life, so convinced that my family's treatment was normal, or at least private. This time I'd been strategic. I'd made friends with Sarah specifically because her mother was a family therapist, someone trained to spot abuse. I'd joined after-school programs, made myself visible to teachers, deliberately created a network of adults who saw me regularly enough to notice the discrepancies. "Why doesn't your mom ever come to your concerts?" my music teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had asked after my 3rd-grade winter recital where I'd played a piano piece I'd spent months perfecting. Melissa had been there. She was always there, the golden child performing in the older kids' ensemble despite being only a year ahead of me. My parents had come for her. They'd left during my performance, claiming Richard had an emergency at the hospital. "She's very busy," I'd said with careful precision, making sure my voice carried just the right note of learned helplessness. Mrs. Patterson's face had done something complicated. She'd started keeping notes. So had Sarah's mother, after the playdate where my mother was 2 hours late picking me up, and arrived reeking of wine, shouting at me for being inconvenient. So had the school counselor after I'd accidentally let slip about sleeping in the garage after Melissa said my breathing at night annoyed her, and my parents had agreed. I was building a case, piece by documented piece, and they had no idea. They still saw me as nothing, invisible, forgettable, beneath notice. That was going to be their downfall. The park incident unfolded exactly as I remembered, with one crucial difference. This time, I was ready. We'd come as a family, rare enough to be notable. Melissa wanted to try out the new playground equipment, and she'd insisted I come along, which meant our parents had ordered it. They liked the optics of having 2 daughters, the appearance of a complete family. It made Richard look more human, more trustworthy to his patients. I'd worn the thin dress deliberately, left my jacket at home despite knowing what was coming. I'd needed it to be bad. The worse it was, the more irrefutable my evidence. The abandonment happened at sunset. Melissa had gotten tired, whining about hunger. My mother had suddenly remembered a hair appointment. Richard needed to review patient files before morning rounds. "We'll come back for her," my mother had said, not even looking at me. "She wants to stay and play." I'd said nothing. 9 years old in body, adult enough in mind to know protest was pointless. Melissa had smirked at me through the car window. "Hope the monsters don't get you." I'd watched them drive away, pulled out the cell phone Marcus had sent me, a basic model just for emergencies, and called him. "They left," I'd said simply. "I'm on my way, 20 minutes. Then I'd called 911. "I'm alone at Morrison Park, and it's getting dark and cold," I'd said, pitching my voice younger, scared. "My family left me here. I don't think they're coming back." The dispatcher had tried to keep me calm, told me to find a safe place, promised help was coming. I'd given them my address, my parents' names, my father's credentials, made sure they knew exactly who had abandoned a 9-year-old in a park after dark. The police arrived first, 11 minutes later. I was shivering by then, genuinely cold, sitting on a bench under the broken streetlight. The female officer had wrapped me in a blanket, fury barely concealed in her professional concern. "How long have you been here, sweetheart?" "Since 6, I'd said. It was 8:47 p.m. They said they'd come back. Marcus arrived 3 minutes later, and I'd played it perfectly, confused when this strange man approached, worried I was in trouble, until he'd knelt down at eye level and said, "Hannah, my name is Marcus Liu. I'm a friend of your mother's, and I've been trying to reach your family. When I heard you were here alone, I came as fast as I could." The police had taken statements. Marcus had provided his credentials, his connection to the family, his concern. He'd offered to take me to the hospital to be checked for hypothermia. My parents arrived at 9:15 p.m., called by the police, humiliated and furious. My mother had tried to claim they'd only been gone 20 minutes, that I was being dramatic. But the park had security cameras newly installed after a vandalism incident 3 months prior, and the footage told a different story. They'd left at 6:42 p.m., 2 hours and 43 minutes. Richard had tried to bluster, to pull rank. "This is a misunderstanding. Hannah knew we were coming back. She's always been prone to dramatics. She's 9 years old and it's 48 degrees outside." The male officer had cut him off. "She's wearing a summer dress. You left her in a park after dark without a phone or any way to contact you." "We forgot she was here," my mother had snapped, and the words had hung in the air like an admission of guilt. Marcus had cleared his throat. "I should mention something," he'd said carefully. "I've been concerned about Hannah for some time. I've noticed patterns. This isn't the first time something like this has happened." The officer's attention had sharpened. "Would you be willing to make a formal statement?" "Absolutely." The CPS investigation opened that night. Unlike my first life, where my father's connections had buried it, this time there was too much evidence, too many witnesses, and a credible alternative guardian already in the picture. Marcus had immediately petitioned for custody, revealing the DNA test results he'd obtained through legal channels, a cheek swab I'd sent him months ago, processed through his lawyer, and demanding an investigation into the family dynamics. The case had blown up exactly as I'd planned. The custody battle took 4 months and destroyed my mother's carefully constructed image completely. Sarah's mother testified about the missed pickups, the times I'd arrived at playdates with bruises or wearing clothes that didn't fit. Mrs. Patterson provided dates and times of every school event my parents had missed for me but attended for Melissa, documented conversations where I'd revealed concerning details about my home life. The school nurse presented photos of injuries I'd sustained over 3 years, none serious enough to mandate reporting individually, but forming a damning pattern collectively. The security footage from the park had been devastating. My mother's voice caught on the 911 recording. "We forgot she was here." My father's attempted intimidation of the police officers, Melissa's smirk visible through the car window in the footage. But the real bombshell came when Marcus's lawyer subpoenaed their financial records. I'd known about the trust fund in my first life. I'd discovered it at 23, purely by accident, buried in paperwork after my grandmother Chen died. Richard's mother had set up trusts for both of her grandchildren, equal amounts, $250,000 each, to be accessed at 18 for education at 25,000 days, for any purpose. Melissa had gotten hers. I never had. Because my father had been quietly draining my trust since I was 6 years old, claiming it as reimbursement for care and expenses for a child not biologically his. By the time I'd found out in my first life, there was less than $30,000 left, and the statute of limitations had passed on most of the theft. This time, the lawyer had caught it early, $148,000 stolen. Melissa's trust untouched at its full value, earning interest. Both trusts, supposedly from a grandmother who'd treated us exactly the same, because she'd never known I wasn't Richard's biological daughter. The judge had been unimpressed with Richard's explanations. The fact that he'd been stealing from a trust established by his own mother for a child she'd believed was her granddaughter, all out of spite for his wife's infidelity, painted a picture of a man vindictive enough to punish a child for existing. My mother's defense had been to blame everything on me. I was difficult, ungrateful, a reminder of her mistake. Her lawyer had tried to frame her as a victim of her own poor choices, drowning under the weight of maintaining a marriage destroyed by infidelity. Melissa had cried on the stand, claimed I was lying about everything, that I was jealous of her and making up stories for attention. But the evidence didn't lie. The recordings, the photos, the financial records, the testimony from neutral third parties, it built an inescapable narrative. The court appointed a guardian ad litem, a stern woman named Catherine Wolfe, who'd spent 3 weeks investigating every aspect of my life. She'd interviewed me extensively, visited both households, reviewed every piece of evidence. Her report had been 47 pages of clinical documentation of systematic emotional and financial abuse, favoritism bordering on pathological, and willful neglect. Marcus and Jennifer's home, by contrast, had been warm, stable, and prepared. They'd set up a room for me, enrolled in parenting classes, provided references from their community. Marcus's sons, my half-brothers, I'd realized with a strange jolt, were 10 and 12, curious and kind, excited about having a sister. The judge's ruling came down on a Friday afternoon, full custody to Marcus Liu, with my mother and Richard Chen allowed only supervised visitation, pending family therapy that I could refuse once I turned 12. My mother was ordered to repay the stolen trust funds with interest. Richard faced potential criminal charges for theft and fraud. I'd walked out of that courthouse holding Marcus's hand, and I hadn't looked back at the family that had never wanted me. That should have been the end of it, my total victory, my clean escape. But I'd been reborn with knowledge of the future, and I knew things that hadn't happened yet. I knew that in 3 years, Melissa was going to win a national figure skating competition that would make her a minor celebrity. I knew my mother was going to publish a lifestyle blog that would go viral, turning her into an influencer with brand deals and speaking engagements. I knew Richard was going to pioneer a new surgical technique that would make him famous in medical circles, leading to a lucrative private practice. In my first life, they'd achieved all of this while I'd been struggling in poverty, and they'd never once reached out. Their success had been built on a foundation of my absence, the troublesome daughter removed, the perfect family image restored. This time, I wasn't just going to escape. I was going to make sure their empire never rose at all. The next phase of my revenge took patience. I was still only 9 years old, then 10, then 11. But I had Marcus's resources now, and more importantly, I had information about the future that I could leverage carefully. Melissa's skating career was built on a specific coach, Elena Volkov, a former Olympian who would relocate to Philadelphia when Melissa was 12. In my first life, my parents had paid her exorbitant fees, and Elena had transformed Melissa from a good skater into a great one. The national championship at 15 had been the culmination of 3 years of intensive training. I convinced Marcus to hire Elena first. It wasn't hard. I'd been taking skating lessons with the money Marcus had given me. I want to try it, I'd told him, carefully not mentioning that I'd been a mediocre skater in my first life, but knew all of Melissa's routines by heart. I'd demonstrated enough talent, borrowed from future memory, to make Marcus think I might be naturally gifted. When Elena's name came up in the skating world, she was considering several offers to relocate and take on private students. Marcus's money spoke loudly. I didn't even have to compete at Melissa's level. Elena took me on because Marcus could pay her asking price plus 20% and because I showed interesting raw potential. Melissa's path to greatness evaporated. The local coaches she was stuck with were fine, but they weren't Elena Volkov. She'd still be good, but she'd never be great. I made sure to send her a video of my first competition, a regional junior championship where I took silver. The note read, "Thought you might want to see. I'm really enjoying skating. My coach says I have potential." My mother's blog had been called The Good Mother's Guide. Ironic, given everything. It had gone viral because of one specific post about raising resilient children that had hit the internet at the perfect cultural moment, right as a parenting controversy was trending. She'd positioned herself as an expert on child development despite having no credentials, and the combination of confidence and timing had made her an authority. I knew the exact date she'd originally posted it, November 3rd, 3 years from now. I spent months writing my own version, better researched, more nuanced hit, backed by actual child psychology, sources that Marcus helped me access through his foundation's connections. I'd learned writing skills in my first life that made my mother's flowery prose look amateurish, and I had Jennifer, who was a freelance journalist, to help me polish it. We published it on November 1st under Jennifer's byline, with a mention of her stepdaughter, me, as inspiration. It went moderately viral, not massive, but enough to saturate the market. When my mother posted her version 2 days later, she was immediately accused of plagiarism. The posts were too similar, the points too aligned. She'd somehow managed to make herself look like she was copying Jennifer Liu's work. Her blog never gained traction, a few hundred followers maybe, compared to the 100,000 she'd had in my first timeline. Richard's surgical technique was trickier. I didn't fully understand the medicine. Even with adult memories, I'd never gone to medical school. But I knew it involved a specific approach to minimally invasive cardiac procedures, and I knew he was going to develop it based on research from a colleague who'd die in a car accident before publishing his findings. I couldn't prevent the colleague's death, didn't know enough details, and wasn't sure I'd want to interfere with fate on that level. But I could make sure the research got published before he died. Marcus's nonprofit had connections to medical research foundations. A generous grant, strategically placed, expedited the colleague's work. His paper published 18 months early with full credit and recognition. When he died, and he did in the same accident at the same time, his legacy was secure. Richard had nothing to build on. The technique already existed, credited to someone else. He was just another cardiac surgeon. I was 12 years old, and I'd systematically demolished every pillar of their future success. They were still comfortable. Richard's surgeon salary ensured that, but they'd never be special, never be celebrated, never rise above the ordinary, and I'd made sure they knew I was thriving. Social media made it easy. Jennifer's accounts showed our family life, vacations to music festivals where I performed with youth orchestras, posts about my skating competitions. I'd made it to nationals by age 12, finished 6th, respectable but not threatening. Photos of me with my half-brothers at the beach, smiling genuinely for the first time in either of my lives. Marcus's foundation featured me in newsletters. Founder's daughter shows early promise in piano and violin, participates in youth mentorship programs. My face on their website, a testament to what supportive parenting looked like. I'd made sure my mother's friends saw it all. Philadelphia's social circles were interconnected, and the women she'd once impressed with her perfect family now whispered about how much happier Hannah Liu, now officially adopted, looked in her new life. The court-ordered family therapy sessions were my favorite torture device. Twice a month, my mother and Richard had to sit in supervised sessions with me if they wanted to maintain even minimal visitation rights. I'd declined to attend once I turned 12, as was my right, but before that, I'd used every session to calmly, clinically detail exactly how their treatment had affected me. The therapist, Dr. Ramos, had been carefully chosen by the court. Someone with no connection to Richard's medical network, no reason to go easy on them. She'd made them confront every documented incident, every piece of evidence, every failure. How did it feel, she'd asked my mother during one session, to tell a 7-year-old that you wished she'd never been born? My mother had tried to claim she didn't remember saying that. I'd pulled out the tape recorder, pressed play. Her voice, crystal clear and venomous, filled the room. She'd actually cried. Not from remorse. I knew her too well to believe that. From humiliation, from the shame of being confronted with her own ugliness in a setting she couldn't control. "Do you understand," Dr. Ramos had said, "that this kind of systematic emotional abuse has lasting psychological effects? That Hannah will carry these wounds for her entire life?" "She seems fine now," Richard had muttered, the first words he'd spoken in 3 sessions. Because she has supportive caregivers now, Dr. Ramos had snapped. Because Marcus and Jennifer Liu have provided the stability and unconditional love that you withheld. Hannah is recovering in spite of you, not because of anything you've done. I'd sat there, impassive, and watched them squirm. These sessions were technically for reconciliation, but I'd made it clear from the start I didn't want a relationship with them. I was there because the court required it, nothing more. Don't you want a relationship with your mother? The therapist had asked me once gently. With your sister? No, I'd said simply. They taught me very well that I'm not part of their family. I learned the lesson. I don't understand why they're upset that I learned it so well. Melissa had been in some of the sessions too, mandatory family therapy designed to heal rifts. She'd been hostile at first, then confused when her usual tactics didn't work, then finally sullen and withdrawn as she realized she'd lost her favorite punching bag. Don't you miss us at all? She'd asked once, 14 years old and genuinely baffled. No, I'd said, meeting her eyes. I've never been happier than I am now, away from all of you. The truth had struck her like a physical blow. She'd expected anger, tears, some sign that I was damaged or desperate for their approval. Instead, I was thriving, and my success made her cruelty retroactively meaningless. I'd taken everything that gave their lives meaning, their golden child skating success, my mother's influencer dreams, Richard's medical innovations, and I'd done it so subtly that they couldn't even pinpoint how it had happened. They just knew that somehow the daughter they'd thrown away had ended up with everything while they stagnated in comfortable mediocrity. But I wasn't done. Not yet. The final piece of my revenge required time and patience, waiting until I was old enough to truly execute it. I'd needed to become someone significant in my own right, not just the victim who'd escaped, but the success story that proved everything they'd believed about me was wrong. And I'd needed them to make one more catastrophic mistake. I was 17 when the opportunity presented itself, and I'd spent the intervening years becoming exactly who I needed to be. The skating had paid off. I'd made it to the U.S. National Championships 4 times, medaled twice, a bronze and a silver. I'd never win gold. I was good, but not quite great, limited by starting too late and a body that wasn't quite built for triple axels. But I was visible, successful enough to be impressive. The music had been my true gift. Marcus's talent had apparently passed through DNA despite us never meeting in my formative years. By 15, I'd mastered 3 instruments. By 17, I'd composed pieces that had been performed by youth orchestras, won competitions, earned scholarship offers from prestigious conservatories. I'd maintained straight A's, involved myself in student government, volunteered with Marcus's foundation, built a resume that would have been impressive for someone from a privileged background and was extraordinary for someone overcoming childhood adversity, which my story had become in certain circles, carefully cultivated. The media loved a good redemption arc, and I'd learned to tell mine strategically. Not a victim begging for sympathy, but a survivor who'd transcended her circumstances. I'd given interviews for Marcus's foundation, speaking about arts education and its role in healing trauma. I'd written an essay about foster care and family court reform that had been published in a major newspaper. I'd become someone people paid attention to. Melissa, meanwhile, had floundered. She'd made it to the national level in skating but never medaled, always just outside the top 10. She'd aged out of junior competitions without achieving the success she'd expected, and the transition to senior level had been brutal. Without Elena Volkov, she'd never developed the technical skills to compete with the best. She'd started college at a mid-tier state school, undecided on major, visibly bitter about her life not matching her childhood expectations. My mother's social media showed a girl who partied too much, posted increasingly desperate selfies seeking validation, dated a string of interchangeable boys who treated her poorly. My mother's blog had never died completely, but it had never thrived either. She had maybe 5,000 followers, most of them inactive. Her posts a combination of wine mom memes and thinly veiled complaints about ungrateful children. She'd aged badly, stress and wine and bitterness etching lines into her face. Richard had continued as a competent surgeon, but nothing more. His colleagues had published the groundbreaking research. He'd been relegated to implementing other people's innovations. He'd gained weight, developed high blood pressure, looked perpetually exhausted. They'd stayed together, locked in their miserable marriage, neither willing to admit that their life hadn't turned out as planned. The perfect family image had cracked, but they kept up appearances, still attended charity events together, still smiled for cameras, still pretended they hadn't systematically abused one daughter while spoiling the other. I'd let them recover slightly, let them think maybe their lives had stabilized at a comfortable plateau. Let them convince themselves that they'd moved past the scandal, that people had forgotten, that they could rebuild their reputations. Then Melissa made a catastrophic error in judgment, and I'd been waiting my entire second life for something exactly like it. It started with a scholarship. The Chen Foundation Memorial Scholarship, to be specific, a $50,000 award my grandmother had established before her death for students pursuing medicine or music. She'd wanted to honor both her son's career and her own love of the arts. The scholarship was awarded annually to a student from the Philadelphia area demonstrating exceptional talent and financial need. I'd qualified on merit easily. My music portfolio was sterling, my academic record impeccable, my financial situation, despite Marcus's wealth, legitimately complicated by the fact that I was legally adopted and my trust fund had been stolen and not fully repaid. The selection committee had chosen me as a finalist, one of 3 students in consideration. The winner would be announced at a gala in December, a high-profile event that Richard's family had hosted for 15 years. Melissa decided to sabotage my application. I found out because I'd planned for it. The paranoia from my first life had never fully left me, and in this timeline, I'd learned to trust my instincts. I'd installed monitoring software on my application accounts, set up alerts, kept digital copies of everything in multiple locations. When my letters of recommendation mysteriously disappeared from the scholarship portal, replaced with blank documents, I noticed immediately. When my music samples were corrupted, unplayable files that made me look incompetent and careless, I had the originals backed up in 3 places. When the committee secretary received an anonymous email claiming I'd plagiarized my essay, I traced the IP address back to Melissa's apartment. She'd been clumsy about it, arrogant in her certainty that she wouldn't be caught. She'd used her own computer, hadn't bothered with a VPN or any real attempt to hide her tracks. The email had been brutal, full of accusations, and evidence that she'd clearly fabricated. Screenshots allegedly showing my essay copied from obscure blog posts, claims that my music compositions were stolen from underground artists. It would have worked maybe if I'd been a normal applicant and she'd been more sophisticated. The committee might have disqualified me pending investigation, given the scholarship to someone else, let the accusation hang over my reputation, even if I eventually cleared my name. But I'd been waiting for this. Some version of this. I'd known that they couldn't help themselves, that eventually their need to destroy me would override their self-preservation instincts. I documented everything, every corrupted file, every deleted document, every moment of sabotage traced back to its source. Then I'd contacted the committee directly, provided the evidence of tampering, and filed a formal complaint, and I'd called the media. Not just local news, I'd cultivated relationships with journalists over the years through my advocacy work. People who knew my story, who'd followed my success, who understood the narrative of a child overcoming systematic abuse. I'd framed it carefully. Former family continues harassment of abuse survivor despite court orders and years of separation. I'd provided the documentation, not just of this incident, but everything. The custody case, the stolen trust fund, the years of neglect, and now this blatant attempt to sabotage my educational opportunities. The story exploded. Philadelphia Magazine ran a feature, The Girl They Tried to Erase, Hannah Lou's Fight for Justice. It laid out everything, the abandonment, the financial theft, the favoritism, the court case, and now Melissa's sabotage attempt. They'd interviewed Dr. Ramos, Sarah's mother, my teachers from childhood, all painting a picture of systematic family abuse followed by years of vindictive harassment. Richard's hospital suddenly faced questions about his judgment and character. How could they employ a man who'd stolen from his own mother's trust fund? Who'd abandoned a child in a park? Whose daughter was now criminally harassing an abuse survivor? My mother's social media became a war zone. The parenting blogger who'd once claimed expertise on raising children was now revealed as a woman who'd told her 7-year-old she wished she'd never been born. Her followers turned on her viciously. Old posts were screenshot and dissected, every piece of advice recontextualized as hypocrisy. Melissa faced criminal charges for computer fraud and harassment. The scholarship committee banned her family from any further involvement with the foundation. My grandmother's other relatives, people I'd never met in my first life, reached out to me with horror and apologies, disgusted by what Richard had done to his mother's legacy. The gala where the scholarship would be announced became a media circus. I'd been invited to attend regardless of whether I won, and I'd accepted. Marcus had tried to talk me out of it. "You don't need to face them, Hannah. You've proven everything you need to prove." But I'd insisted. I needed to be there for the ending. The ballroom was magnificent, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble, the kind of venue that Richard's family had always used to showcase their wealth and status. I'd never been to one of these events in my first life. Children weren't invited, and by the time I was old enough, I'd been long estranged. I arrived with Marcus, Jennifer, and my brothers, all of us dressed impeccably. Jennifer had helped me choose a gown, deep emerald silk that made me look older than 17, sophisticated and untouchable. My hair was professionally styled, my makeup subtle but flawless. I looked like I belonged there. More than that, I looked like I'd earned it. The room fell silent when we walked in. People stared, whispered, the story so fresh that I was instantly recognizable. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, a few disgust. But that was directed past me, toward the corner where my mother, Richard, and Melissa stood in a tight defensive cluster. They looked terrible. My mother's dress was expensive but ill-fitting, her face drawn and heavily made up to hide the stress. Richard had the trapped expression of a man watching his reputation crumble in real time. Melissa was barely holding back tears, her usual confidence shattered by the criminal charges and public condemnation. The scholarship committee chair, Eleanor Chen, my grandmother's sister, my great-aunt by blood if not relationship, stood at the microphone for the announcement. She was a formidable woman in her 80s, and the look she'd given Richard when we'd arrived could have stripped paint. "Before we announce this year's recipient," Eleanor said, her voice carrying despite her age, "I want to address the recent controversy surrounding this scholarship. My sister established the Chen Foundation Memorial Scholarship to nurture talent and support young people pursuing their dreams. She believed deeply in family, in loyalty, in the responsibility we have to lift up the next generation." She paused and her gaze moved deliberately to Richard. "It has come to my attention that these values were not upheld within her own immediate family, that a young woman deserving of support and love was instead subjected to cruelty and neglect, that my sister's own trust, established out of love for her grandchildren, was misused and stolen from a child who had no power to protect herself." The room was absolutely silent. People had stopped even pretending not to stare. "This scholarship was meant to honor my sister's legacy," Eleanor continued. "It would be a profound dishonor to that legacy to allow family politics or personal vendettas to corrupt the selection process. The committee has reviewed all applications thoroughly, verified every piece of documentation, and ensured that our decision is based solely on merit, talent, and need." She opened an envelope and I saw Richard's jaw clench. He knew what was coming. They all did. "This year's Chen Foundation Memorial Scholarship is awarded to Hannah Liu in recognition of her exceptional musical talent, her academic achievements, and her resilience in the face of unconscionable adversity." The applause was thunderous. People stood, a standing ovation for a scholarship announcement, which never happened. But this wasn't really about the scholarship anymore. It was a collective statement. We see you, we believe you, we support you. I walked to the podium with my head high, shook Eleanor's hand, accepted the ceremonial certificate and the actual check. $50,000 for college, full validation from my grandmother's family, public vindication in the very space where Richard's family had always celebrated themselves. Eleanor hugged me, whispered in my ear, "Your grandmother would have been so proud of you. I'm sorry we didn't know. I'm sorry we didn't protect you." I'd prepared a speech. Marcus had helped me practice it. I'd planned to be gracious, thankful, focused on the future. But standing there, looking out at the crowd, seeing my mother's face contorted with barely suppressed rage and Melissa's tears and Richard's defeat, I'd deviated from the script. "Thank you," I'd said into the microphone. "This scholarship means more to me than I can adequately express. Not just because of the financial support, though that's significant, but because it represents something I was told my entire childhood that I'd never have: recognition, value, a place in a family legacy." I'd let that sink in, watched Richard's face flush. My grandmother died when I was young, too young to really know her. But I've learned about her through this foundation, through the people who loved her, through the values she embodied. She believed that talent should be nurtured, that children should be protected, that family meant something sacred. My mother had looked like she might faint. "I'm grateful to have received this scholarship in her name. I'm grateful to the committee for looking past the attempts to sabotage my application and seeing the merit of my work. I'm grateful to my father, Marcus Liu, and my mother, Jennifer Liu, for showing me what family is supposed to look like. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to use this scholarship to continue pursuing music, to honor my grandmother's memory the way she deserved to be honored." I'd paused, looked directly at Richard. By supporting talent, encouraging growth, and treating young people with the dignity and respect every child deserves. The applause had been even louder. People understood exactly what I'd said, and more importantly, what I'd left unsaid. I'd walked back to my seat without looking at them again. They'd become irrelevant. The fallout continued for months. Melissa's case went to trial. She'd tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, that she'd just been trying to help by fact-checking my application. But the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern of sabotage, the anonymous email, the deliberate corruption of files. She'd been convicted of computer fraud and harassment, given a suspended sentence and community service since it was her first offense. But the conviction stayed on her record. Her college had suspended her pending an ethics investigation. Her skating career, already struggling, ended completely. No program wanted the liability of someone convicted of fraud. Richard had lost his position as chief of cardiology at his hospital. The board had determined that the scandal and his demonstrated lack of judgment made him unsuitable for leadership. He'd kept his job as a surgeon, but the demotion was public and humiliating. His colleagues avoided him. His reputation, built over decades, had crumbled in months. My mother's blog had been deleted after the harassment became too intense. She'd tried to reframe herself as a victim of a difficult marriage, of a child who'd come between them, of circumstances beyond her control, but no one was buying it. The recordings, the testimony, the documented years of abuse were too damning. The Chen family had formally disowned Richard, removing him from any family foundations or boards, making it clear he no longer represented their values. Eleanor had reached out to me repeatedly, trying to build a relationship, to make amends for their years of unknowing neglect. I'd been gracious but cautious. They were family by blood, but they were strangers. Marcus and Jennifer and my brothers were my family now. I'd chosen to attend Juilliard, full scholarship, based entirely on my musical merit. The money from my grandmother's scholarship was safely invested, building toward a future I'd never been able to imagine in my first life. Before I left for New York, there was one final confrontation. My mother had requested a meeting, just her and me, supervised if I insisted, at a neutral location. She'd sent the request through Dr. Ramos, claimed she wanted closure, a chance to apologize. I'd almost refused, but Marcus had encouraged me to go, if only for my own peace of mind. "You don't owe her anything," he'd said, "but sometimes saying goodbye helps us move forward." We'd met at a coffee shop, Dr. Ramos present but seated at a distance, giving us privacy while remaining available. My mother had looked older, worn down by months of public condemnation and private consequences. "I know you hate me," she'd started, hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness." "You don't," I'd agreed, my voice calm. "And I don't hate you. I don't feel anything for you at all." That had hurt her more than anger would have. I'd seen it in the way she'd flinched. "I want you to understand why," she'd begun, and I'd cut her off. "I don't care why. I spent my first life trying to understand, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, how I could fix it. I spent years in therapy working through the damage you caused. I understand the psychology of it now, your guilt about the affair, your displacement of blame, your need to maintain the marriage at any cost, even if that cost was your own daughter's well-being. I'd leaned forward slightly. Here's what I need you to understand. None of it mattered. None of your reasons, your excuses, your justifications. You were the adult. I was the child. You had all the power and you chose to use it to hurt someone who couldn't fight back. That's not complicated. That's just cruel. She'd started crying. I was overwhelmed. I didn't know how to handle Richard's resentment, and you looked so much like Marcus, I'd finished. I know, you saw my real father every time you looked at me, and instead of dealing with your guilt, you punished me for existing. I understand. I just don't care. Don't you want a relationship? She'd asked desperately. I'm still your mother. No, I'd said simply. You're the woman who gave birth to me. Marcus is my father. Jennifer is my mother. You're nothing to me now except a cautionary tale. I'd stood up, prepared to leave, but I'd stopped and looked back at her. I want you to know something. In my first life, in the version of events where I didn't get a second chance, I died alone. I died poor, working a minimum wage job, estranged from all of you because your treatment had left me too damaged to form healthy relationships. I died with no one at my funeral, no one who cared, a burden that the state had to dispose of. Her face had gone white. What are you talking about? You killed me, I'd said softly. Not literally, but the person I could have been, the life I should have had. You destroyed it. You destroyed it and then you succeeded. You became an influencer. Melissa became a skating star. Richard became famous in his field. You built your perfect life on the foundation of my absence. I'd let that sink in. This time, I took it all from you. Every piece of success you would have had, every achievement, every moment of recognition, I made sure it never happened. Melissa will never be a champion. Your blog will never go viral. Richard will never be more than competent. You'll live comfortable but meaningless lives, and every day you'll know that somewhere, I'm thriving without you. I'd walked to the door, paused with my hand on it. That's my revenge. Not that you suffered, though you did. Not that you were exposed, though you were. My revenge is that I'm happy, and you know that my happiness required your complete removal from my life. You had a daughter who could have loved you, and you threw her away. Now you get to live with that choice. I'd left her there, crying into cold coffee, and I'd never looked back. 5 years later, I was 22, and my life was everything I'd never let myself dream in my first life. I'd graduated from Juilliard with honors, performed at Carnegie Hall as part of a showcase for emerging composers, had pieces commissioned by orchestras in 3 countries. I'd been featured in music magazines, interviewed about my compositions, and my advocacy work for arts education in underserved communities. Marcus's foundation had grown significantly, and I'd become actively involved, using my platform to raise awareness and funding. My brothers and I were close, genuinely loving siblings who supported each other's successes without jealousy or competition. I'd met someone, a violinist named David, kind and talented and patient with my occasional difficulty trusting people. We'd been together for a year, and while I wasn't sure yet if it was forever, I was sure that I was capable of healthy love, that the damage from my first life hadn't been permanent. I performed regularly, taught music to children through Marcus's foundation, published essays about trauma and recovery and art as healing. I'd built a life that mattered, that helped people, that brought genuine joy. I'd heard through the grapevine that Melissa had gotten married, a quick courthouse wedding to someone she'd known for 6 months, already showing signs of strain, that my mother had gotten divorced from Richard finally, moved to a small apartment, worked a job in retail management. That Richard had remarried someone younger, was trying to pretend his first family had never existed. They'd fractured completely without me as their common enemy, their common failure. Without someone to blame for their unhappiness, they'd turned on each other. I didn't feel triumphant learning this. I didn't feel much of anything. They'd become characters in a story I'd finished telling, people I'd known in another life. The night of my Carnegie Hall debut, I'd stood backstage in a gown Jennifer had helped me choose, Marcus straightening my necklace with the careful attention that had become so familiar, so comforting. My brothers were in the audience, David beside them, friends I'd made over the years scattered throughout the seats. The performance had been my own composition, a piece about rebirth, about phoenix fire transformation, about destroying old lives to build new ones. The reviews would call it hauntingly beautiful and deeply personal, would launch my career to a new level. But in that moment backstage, waiting to go on, I'd thought about the park. The cold darkness, the moment they'd driven away, the despair of being 9 years old and abandoned, both times. In my first life, that moment had defined me. The abandonment had been the pattern of my entire existence, reinforced over and over until I'd believed I was fundamentally unlovable, unworthy of care or consideration. In this life, that same moment had been my catalyst. The trap I'd set, the evidence I'd needed, the beginning of my total victory. Same moment, different meanings, all because I'd been given impossible knowledge and a second chance. I'd never know why I'd been reborn. Maybe it was magic, maybe cosmic justice, maybe random chance. But I'd taken the gift and I'd used it mercilessly, and I'd built a life from the ashes of the one they'd destroyed. As I'd walked onto that stage, hearing the applause, seeing the lights, feeling the weight of my violin in my hands, I'd thought, this is what they tried to prevent. This moment, this joy, this success. They'd worked so hard to keep me small, invisible, crushed beneath their contempt. And here I was anyway, reborn and radiant, having taken back everything they'd stolen, plus everything they'd hoped to have. The music had poured out of me, every note a declaration of survival, of victory, of life lived on my own terms. The audience had been rapt, silent except for the strings, and when the final note faded, the applause had been thunderous. I'd bowed, smiled, felt Marcus's pride radiating from the audience like a physical force, and I'd thought, with fierce satisfaction, they left me at the park after dark. After Rebirth, I never met them at parks again. I never met them anywhere again, and I'd never been happier.